Why is Qatar spending a humongous $220 billion on the 2022 FIFA World Cup? The World Cup is one competition that is not only resource-intensive but also one of the most expensive endeavors any group of people, organization, or government can take on. Therefore it should come as no surprise that FIFA only awards hosting privileges to nations whose government has approved their bid to host a FIFA competition. Previously, countries budgeted for the expense of hosting a World Cup, but recent revelations revealed a dramatic increase in that expense. The cost of hosting the World Cups in 2006 and 2010 was less than that of the 2002 World Cup, despite the argument that inflation may have played a role. When analyzing the financial effects of a World Cup, there are typically a variety of factors at play. The costs of the previous World Cups from 1994 to 2022 are listed below. USA spent $500 million in 1994, France spent $2.3 billion in 1998. Japan spent $7 billion in 2002, Germany spent $4.3 billion in 2006, South Africa spent $3.6 billion in 2010. In 2014 Brazil spent $15 billion, and in 2018 Russia spent $11 billion. FIFA takes into account the infrastructure and level of development of a country, before awarding the hosting rights of a World Cup to that nation. A nation without some of these, however, might still be given the hosting rights, with enough lead time to make these arrangements. This explains clearly why Germany's $4.3 billion World Cup cost was significantly lower than South Korea and Japan's $7 billion 2002 hosting cost. While Russia spent $11.2 billion to host the 2018 World Cup, Qatar has spent more than 20 times that amount. Qatar will need to spend $220 billion to host the 2022 World Cup. The hosts are expecting around 1.2 million visitors for this year's event, being the first ever World Cup in that region. A staggering $10 billion was spent on building new stadiums as part of the funds used. Beyond sports, a sizable portion of the $220 billion was spent on infrastructure and transportation. In fact, according to some officials involved in the planning of the World Cup, Qatar 2022 is not an isolated event, but rather a part of a massive national urbanization plan that is nationwide. The communications executive director for the tournament, Fatma Al-Nuaimi stressed that national facilities and industry will receive a massive facelift. There is also intensive development of education and healthcare systems. In 2019, a massive $36 billion went into constructing an underground transportation network, which supporters will use during the tournament. The country also spent $16 billion on the Hamad International Airport, all to make transportation easier and seamless. However, the downside of the Qatar hosting rights is the human rights issues, with talks about how laborers and workers are treated, since work towards hosting of the World Cup in the country began. About 2,000 labor complaints were placed at the Ministry of Labor, against firms and institutions involved in construction around Qatar, in December. Amnesty International has also been involved, as a huge number of workers and human rights bodies have called for sanctions against the Asian country. This is the first World Cup in the Middle East, the first in the desert, so it is expected that the number of funds that have gone into it will be astronomical. It appears that the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar will be the most expensive for a while, inflation or not, with the massive construction of stadiums, 5-star hotels, and a functional transportation system that includes an underground tunnel. However, the next edition involving 3 hosts in 2026, this may move the costs a few notches higher, given that it will be hosted by a combination of the USA, Canada, and Mexico.